all set.
Sorry for that.
That's problem. Then we have this for later. So.
Oh, nice.
Yep.
Fancy.
Ok, buongiorno a tutti, sono le mie ultime parole in italiano, so apology if I'm switching to English right away. Thanks everyone for coming to this section. My name is Filippo Di Salvo. I'm a researcher and a journalist from Italy. I work on research and reporting on whistleblowing, data security, surveillance, and related issues. And I'm very, very happy here to moderate this panel with my two guests here. So thanks again to the festival for having us, and all the technicians and the volunteers who are helping us together with this today. And what are we going to do is discussing, as you can see from the title of the session, on how to report on X, leaks, and data breaches, which means that we consider these things as different and not as the same. I'm going to just do a brief introduction to the topic and the other speakers. So, okay, this doesn't work. We live in time where whistleblowing has become increasingly important and relevant for contemporary journalism and democracy. In the past years, we have some of the most important cases of all the time when it comes to whistleblowing. We definitely had Chelsea Manning with everything that happened with WikiLeaks back in 2010 and later. And now, 5 years ago, we had the Snowden case, which was one of the biggest whistleblowing cases. Again, so we have a clear idea of what whistleblowing is from at least the 70s when the Watergate and the Pentagon Papers happened, and whistleblowing is a tradition that has been adapted thanks to digital tools and so on, but basically we may disagree on this, and we will discuss this later. It is still the same thing that used to be before the internet. It's done differently, some things have changed, but whistleblowing is a stable, fixed issue and tool, I would say, for journalists. But in the past 2 years at least, and maybe longer, hackers have also come to the scene. They have entered the journalism sphere and the journalism realm by becoming sources, by influencing reporting, by bringing up stories. So we can now think that hackers are news sources, and that digital tools and the internet have empowered them in coming to reporters with potential stories. This is a selection of news stories that had hackers in the headlines from the US, from the UK, and also from Italy. So there has been a lot of buzz about hackers recently and the role they can have in democracy and in information. And when we talk about hackers, we probably have different things in mind. We might think about coders, white hat hackers, black hat hackers, criminals, spies, people operating within the intelligence community, and so on. So maybe we could also discuss who hackers are, what hackers do later during the conversation. I just have to confess that I have a fetish for stock images of hackers. These are some of the hackers you probably work with sometimes. So, yeah. So, you know, usually in the media, hackers are portrayed this way as criminal. This is actually my favorite one. I don't know if you ever met anyone like this. But so again, whistleblowing, as I was saying, this is an academic definition coming from the early 90s. Whistleblowing is a disclosure by organization members of illegal, immoral, or illegitimate practices under the control of the employers to person or organization that may be able to affect action. So basically, Snowden going to journalists saying there is something going on with the NSA practices and the NSA program that is probably illegal. Hey guys, help me raising awareness around this whistleblowing. But then, and we will discuss this in detail today, hackers are starting to do something similar, something close in reach out to reporters with data and information about potential stories with probably different aims and different goals in mind. And something that Gabriella Coleman, who is one of the most influential and important and bright researchers about hacking culture, has defined as the public interest hack, is now happening more and more frequent. And just to make it brief, a public interest hack is a computer infiltration done for the purpose of leaking documents. So documents are taken away from computer networks and brought to the public attention online and so on to have a political consequence. So here we have to consider political as a very broad term, not that anything that happened is strictly political or has to do with politics, but it has to do with the public sphere. It has to do with the public. So this is something we are definitely going to discuss today, and this one comes again from Gabriella Coleman's paper, is a list of cases of this kind that date back to 2008 with the hack of Sarah Palin up to 2017 with the hack of the Emmanuel Macron campaign. So what we would like to do here today is to understand and trying to figure out what are the differences between classic leaks done by whistleblowers and hacks. What are the differences in particular for journalists who are asked to report on this material? And a question that I start to pose to you guys and to the audience is, are hackers always whistleblower when they leak, or are they something different and according to the material they carry and so on? And we also discuss best practices in source protection, both technically and legally. Today we are going to do this with two great guests that I'm very happy to have here. Here on my left you have Joseph Cox. He's a journalist reporting about cybersecurity, digital underground, and the surveillance industry for Motherboard. Here on my left, and with Julie Posetti, who is instead a journalist and an academic. She's about to start working at the Reuters Center for the Study of Journalism at the Oxford University in the UK, and she's also the author of Protecting Journalist Sources in the Digital Age, which was published by UNESCO last year. So we have lots to discuss now, and I would like to start with you, Joseph, to describe the kind of work that you have done. Joseph is really one of the journalists that have been working more with hackers and other sources of this kind in the past year, so he has a lot of experience to share with us. So I'll leave you the floor for now.
Yeah, you just want to load my slides up.
And then yep.
Yeah. So as mentioned, I'm Joseph Cox. I cover hackers who may break into companies, surveillance companies that may sell hacking software to law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and the cybersecurity issues around that as well. Just bring it over, I'll do it. No worries. Cool. Yeah, so as part of that beat, I obviously cover a lot of data breaches, and that covers a lot of different industries. So that could start with Silicon Valley. Sorry, and just to say, when I say I've covered these hacks, this means the hacker actually provided us with the data, and then they went out and verified it, and then we broke these stories. So there's the Dropbox hack, VK, which is Russia's Facebook, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security. Ironically, a firm which hacks phones for law enforcement was itself hacked. Even a plastic surgeon which provides services to the royal family. Dating websites such as Fling, and a tipster just told me that data of 40 million people is now publicly available. So if you know the URL, you can go download that. Obviously, don't do that. Accounts from a porn site, and then there's lots of those. The one I did the other day was when a bestiality website was hacked, and it had identifying IP addresses and email addresses and all of that.
All fine.
And then back to Silicon Valley as well. And the reason I just listed all these is because it's really, really broad, and this impacts a lot of different people and a lot of different areas of our society as well. So obviously, reporting breaches is going to be somewhat similar to other journalistic practices and other journalistic beats, but there are some things which are a little bit different. So as opposed to some journalists who are out doing real journalism, putting themselves in harm's way, I just sit on my computer a lot, and I wait for a hacker to contact me. This will be in one of several encrypted chat programs, maybe RISJ, which obfuscates your metadata and encrypts your messages, or Jabber, which is heavily used in the cybercrime underground. Technologists, activists also use it, and hackers in general. The hacker will then send me the data, and they'll say the impacted company, what the data is, maybe how they obtained it, because we're a technology publication, so we're interested in that as well. And that data could include anything. That could be emails, documents, financial spreadsheets, source code of products. And the hacker is going to send me either a cache or a sample of the data. We were just talking, obviously, about whistleblowers. A lot of my sources are not whistleblowers. They are just straight-up criminals who want to sell this data for money. So they're not going to send me the full amount of data that they're also trying to sell. They're going to send me a sample so I can write a nice little article and they can get some free advertising. That is their motivation. And obviously you bear that in mind as a journalist and you balance accordingly. But then the ones who are more interested in highlighting some sort of injustice or issue, they may send you the full cache. And then it's the best bit, verifying that data. You can't really just go to a company and say, hey, were you hacked? Because they'll say no, and they won't reply to your emails or the phone calls. So you have to take this data, and you have to figure out how does it actually relate to this website or service. So the way you typically might start that is probing the company's infrastructure. Just for the sake of example, let's say a porn site is hacked, and I have a load of email addresses and passwords, and I have to figure out that they came from this porn website. I can't just go and start logging into porn accounts because that's very illegal and very unethical for a journalist to do. So you have to trick the website legally into confirming that's where the data came from. So one way is to go to the porn website, try to create a new account, start putting in those email addresses, and hopefully the website will say, sorry, you can't do that. There's already an account with that email registered. So you've essentially tricked the service into confirming those emails are actually from there. Oh, another one, you're just probing. If it's emails, you may go through the headers of the email, find an IP address, and then maybe you can bring that back to the company, but obviously that's a lot easier to fabricate. And these hackers, I wouldn't say often, but sometimes they also do tamper with the data and also add bits for whatever reason. Maybe they think it's funny or whatever. But you have to verify each piece of data that you can. And then contacting victims as like a journalist normally would. This can be hard. There was one in summer 2016 when a medical center in the US was hacked. A lot of the victims, unfortunately, were senior citizens. And when a journalist from Europe phones them up at whatever hour of the morning and starts barking down the phone that their GP has been hacked and all of their data is gone, they're going to be pretty confused and not really going to understand what's going on, which is not their fault. It's just a very unusual situation. And then you'll have, as I mentioned, that bestiality website. None of the people got back to me who apparently used that website. So that wasn't a way that we could verify it, which is understandable. So it varies case by case. At this point, you're probably going to do some writing. Not publish, but just get it down. So what the breach is, what data was, how you know, that sort of thing. Just so it's ready, because then you do the fun bit, which is approaching the company. And I leave it at this stage because you really don't know how they're going to react. As I mentioned, they may just deny it. They may send a legal threat, which happens from time to time. They may quietly fix the security issue and then say, well, we're not hacked. What are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with our website. So I leave that relatively late. Or what has also happened before is they push out a press release announcing their data breach before you get a chance to put your article out because they want to get ahead of the news. Now, this is a bit which I think is fairly unique to data breach reporting. When a hacker discovers a vulnerability in a website, let's say Netflix, that lets you take over a Netflix account, they're going to go to Netflix and say, hey, there's a security issue. Please, could you fix it? Do you want to fix it? Netflix will do that, and then the hacker will talk about it publicly, or the security researcher. This is so third parties can't go maliciously download data, whatever it may be. Personally, and I think probably editorially at Motherboard, we don't typically do that. If you write a piece which is like, hey, if you go to this URL, you can download 500,000 social security numbers, that's not really the most responsible thing to do as a journalist. So you choose what to include, what to omit. If the issue hasn't been fixed, you don't want to give people clues on how to find this data, but hopefully the company fixes it. And then you publish your piece. So there are hackers who do work in the public interest. I've had ones which surveillance companies, they'll target a surveillance company, and they found that this technology is being sold to Bahrain or Oman or Saudi Arabia or whoever it may be, and they feel there's public interest in highlighting that. There are others, as I mentioned, that don't care about that. One of the most famous examples is the Dark Overlord. This is a hacking group that appeared in summer 2016. And you'll probably know them from when they tried to blackmail Netflix and they got $50,000. That was obviously a lot more recent. When they started, they were very small, just targeting medical centers, that sort of thing. Now, what they do here is they'll hack a company, they'll give the data to a journalist who will then verify and do an article, and then that article is used to exert pressure on the hacking victim to solicit a ransom payment. And I figured this out from actually talking to them and saying, look, this is your strategy. You're clearly trying to manipulate the media. So that is obviously something that journalists are going to have to bear in mind, because not everybody is Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden. And it also brings up the point of the motivation of the source. In this case, they want to blackmail Netflix, and they're financially motivated. That is just as important a part of the story as like the hack or the data itself. If you did a story about, oh, Netflix got hacked and it's really, really bad, the framing of that is on the Netflix screwed up somehow. But if you do, Netflix is actually succumbing to an ongoing, prolonged blackmail campaign, that significantly changes the context and the frame of the story. And I think we'll probably talk about nation-state hackers and how they play into that as well. So there's just two other points that I just want to make, really, is this omitting and this in what data to include. So 2 companies were hacked, and these companies provide software to just install on your phone. It's for husbands to monitor their wives, their GPS locations, their text messages, their emails, their Facebook messages, everything. It's exceptionally powerful software. A couple of independent groups of hackers targeted 2 different companies and gave the data to us because they thought this is, an outrageous practice and we want to expose it. Included in that is credit card details, internal documents, email addresses, all of that sort of thing. The most interesting thing, well, one of the most interesting things to me was that it actually included the GPS locations of people who had been subjected to this malware. So we could see that this company, or these companies, were selling malware to people across the world. Now, you don't just publish the GPS locations of thousands of people who may be subject to domestic violence, stalking, and in some cases, sexual violence and rape. But I still wanted to get across the scale of this issue to the reader. So I wrote a quick little dirty Python script just to obfuscate the GPS locations by, 10 or 20 miles, something like that. So you can obviously there see that it's heavily concentrated in North America, and then you have some in Southeast Asia and that sort of thing, without harming these individuals or these communities. And again, I'm talking really generally here. Obviously, there's going to be some whistleblowers and some leaks that, where this doesn't quite fit. But data breaches are typically going to impact a lot of people who are just totally ordinary people going about their lives, whereas if it's a leak from some company that should be exposed, the people in there are probably already going to be figures of public interest. Whereas writing about that, hey, John Smith is a member of a bestiality website, and pointing at specific individuals isn't really appropriate for a journalist to do. And these data breaches, which again affect lots of ordinary people, that can really impact their lives. So Ashley Madison was a dating website, and it was hacked in 2015, I think. People killed themselves after that data came out because it revealed that they'd been having extramarital affairs because they were in this database. So this can really impact completely ordinary people. And then just the last thing is that, well, that point I made earlier about some hackers fabricate, and to be frank, bullshit, and they'll just try to push wherever they can through a journalist, and unfortunately sometimes they don't catch it. One example is when some hackers targeted NASA, and they believed they had obtained video footage from drones spying on the world. And they thought, oh my God, this is really, really important. We have to show this. So they sent the data to us, or more specifically my colleague Lorenzo, and he found that the drone footage was stuff that NASA had just released anyway as part of its public affairs, as part of its normal operations. So he wrote this piece. The NASA hack is probably the most mundane hack ever. And then the hackers got really annoyed and started to try and attack us and shit. And then those were the same hackers who hacked the CIA director and some people in the FBI, and I think most of them have been sentenced now. But the point that shows is, whereas a whistleblower and a leaker is going to be inside an organization, like Snowden, even though he's not going to understand every single surveillance program, he may have a general understanding of how the internet works. Or if you're inside the organization, or if you're inside the organization behind the Panama Papers, you're probably going to understand what this data means. Hackers are looking from the outside in. They're going to go into an organization. Yeah, they may be able to get around the infrastructure, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're actually going to be able to understand what it is they have obtained. And that means they can exaggerate what they've actually got, misunderstand it, and then as a journalist, you have to make sure that you're not being led along by that. And just the last example I give is, especially with all this Facebook scraping stuff at the moment, a few years ago, a hacker gave me a data breach from Foursquare, which is that app where you check into places. And it was just a public scrape of phone numbers and email addresses, which was publicly available on the website. So in my opinion, there wasn't a story there. Maybe in this climate of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook scraping, it might be a story. So if you want a free story, there it is. You can go get that data if you want, because I'm not going to do it. But again, the person who gave me that data didn't even realize what they had. That's what I want to say. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Joseph.
Just might bear with us while
we have to move. Yep. So we move to Julie, and I think we have lots of material to discuss from what Joseph said so far. And
so this is not working, right?
Oh, it is.
Oh, it is. Okay.
We discuss hackers as news sources. So this one. Sorry. Here we go.
Great, thanks. That was incredibly fascinating. And I guess I'm coming at this discussion from the perspective of reporting on leaks and potentially data breaches when the individual or individuals involved tend to be whistleblowers, when they are the kind of confidential sources that we traditionally regarded as people acting in the public interest to release information with a desire to effect some sort of social change that we might perceive to be positive, rather than the incredibly interesting but deeply frightening characters that you're sometimes dealing with. So I want to follow on from this idea to pick up on the research that I've done over the past several years, examining the way in which journalists interact with whistleblowers and confidential sources, and to introduce you to a project which I'm working on with an organisation called Blueprint for Free Speech. It's a small NGO that focuses on whistleblowers and is also trying to identify how we describe best practice when it comes to journalists working with whistleblowers and confidential sources in the context of trends around hacking. How do we differentiate between a whistleblower and a malicious hacker? And as part of this project, which is funded by Open Society Foundations, is developing a handbook for journalists journalists that presents guidelines and principles for action. And this is really timely. What have I just done, Philip? Yep. I've managed to... Technology wizard. Thank you.
It should be working.
It's just having a
again?
moment.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
So it's trying to... I just want to go back one moment. Trying to develop guidelines that are practical for journalists. And this is the study that Philip alluded to that I led for UNESCO when I was based with the World Editors Forum in 2014 and 2015. It was rigorous. It took 2 years to get published in the context of an intergovernmental organisation and a contentious issue like the impact of surveillance, for example, on journalistic communications with confidential sources. But it has a bunch of recommendations that I'd encourage you to go and examine, and some of you will see flyers on the front seats, and I've got some up here which have the URL for the download of this study, which you can get some hard copies, but they're not readily available anymore. It is readily available for download. And I'm encouraging you to do this because there were many recommendations coming from this study which looked at 121 countries around the world and examined about a decade's worth of data back to 2007 and tried to map the implications for journalists dealing with confidential sources as regards the intervention of surveillance and data retention, metadata handover, the sort of overreach of national security and anti-terrorism legislation, and what kinds of impacts those developments were having on the traditional idea of journalists promising confidentiality to sources who deserved confidentiality based on all the sorts of ethical determinations that Joseph outlined in reference to hackers. But usually starting from a point of assuming that a person was operating in the public interest and then trying to disprove that if that was the case. So among these recommendations was the need for journalists to be increasingly trained in digital defence tactics, to be considering training their sources and whistleblowers they were working with or had previously worked with, which to many journalists working in traditional contexts was a surprising kind of activist recommendation, that you might become involved with your sources in a manner that actually empowered them to deliver information. So it's fitting that we then end up in this situation where we're developing guidelines, a separate organisation, acting on some of the guidelines that were in this study. So as I said, it's OSF funded, and it is based on this desire to develop best practice, although it's difficult to define best practice in a really rapidly changing environment. And it's coming at a time where we now do have increased awareness. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I'm sure, Joseph, you've got insights into this, getting journalists to even acknowledge that this was a risk beyond just those working on national security stories, for example, was difficult. I mean, Snowden changed everything at a particular level, and it's taken several years for that kind of general awareness to become better disseminated. I think we're now in a situation where journalists are, particularly in light of Cambridge Analytica, I think we've seen another kind of boost to the sort of need for awareness. We're seeing a real desire for an upskilling of journalists in regard to these processes. So we're seeing also global attacks on transparency and privacy, for example, happening at the same time as there are implications for people who are whistleblowers. And we're seeing an erosion of the capacity to do investigative and accountability journalism as a result of these attacks, which are in some cases state-sponsored, in some cases corporate actors using technology that is increasingly easy to access to intercept, for example. So here is a bit of a pitch. Anybody in the room who is from a news outlet or an organisation that supports independent and particularly investigative journalism, we're looking for partner organisations, not for funding, you'll be pleased to hear, but to help us to actually determine what these best practice guidelines should look like through advice and experience, and also distribution eventually of these guidelines. So the partners we have so far are the International Centre for Journalists, several people here from that excellent organisation, which is very much global and goes beyond the kind of role of investigative journalism dependent on confidential sources in a liberal Western democracy, and also examines the very real implications for both whistleblowers and journalists working in environments where it's not just your job that's at stake, it's literally your life. And I recognise that that can be a risk in developed democracies too. And the World Editors Forum is another partner we're working at the moment. So the way we're going about this, it's a project with a pretty tight timeline. We hope to have the handbook launched in November, and we've just now, this is the, I guess, formal launch of a survey that is seeking to get feedback globally from journalists and from organisations that deal with whistleblowers. So there's a link on the screen, but I've got plenty of these brochures that I can give you as well. We're going to be interviewing journalists and experts in this space as part of this process. So in the time that I've got, and Philip, how much time do I have?
About still 8 minutes, so... Yeah.
How nice and rare in my case. I'm not running out of time. I just want to run through the principles as we've identified them so far. So we have these draft principles that the survey is seeking to test. And number one is a bit of a no-brainer. It's the principle of first protect your sources. So we have a set of 20 draft principles, and I'm not going to test you on them at the end, but I am going to try and seek some feedback. So if you balk at any of these, or you think, well, you know, where is principle X and how could they have avoided that, please let me know. And I think one that's important, especially in light of the coverage and the framing of hackers and the realities of reporting on hackers, where whistleblowers are often conflated with malicious hackers, you know, and so getting journalists, in terms of their reporting on whistleblowers, not necessarily their dealings with whistleblowers, to recognise the risks and the costs to well-intentioned whistleblowers of putting their lives, their jobs, their livelihoods on the line. Defending anonymity when it's requested. I mean, again, in light of WikiLeaks and Snowden and various other stories, anonymity is has been a vexed and difficult issue. And we've had many journalists, for example, reporting with a degree of fervour on various states' attempts to make it easier and easier and easier to access information, with calls for the abandonment of anonymity as a principle, or in fact the criminalisation of anonymity, as happens in some states. But we think it's an important and quite fundamental understanding that's required of journalists in dealing with confidential sources. We're also suggesting that there is a need for journalists to recognise a process of digital risk assessment on every story that involves a whistleblower or a confidential source. As much as there's increased awareness in newsrooms around the world and among editors, there is a persistent and disturbing level of ignorance when it comes to the potential risks of working with confidential sources and whistleblowers whose risks are extremely high, who are not necessarily, Joe from Panama Papers fame, who has a very high level of digital savvy to start with, but who are working in the public service of a government, for example. And so there is a need for the journalists, we would argue, to take ethical responsibility to enact that ethical obligation to protect their sources. To take responsibility for data hygiene and digital defence, to get the training that you need to make sure that you are able to have secure communications as much as that is humanly possible now with sources and whistleblowers. To embrace and use encryption. I'm sure you've seen the flurry of stories in my own country, Australia, where I'm currently based, one of the Five Eyes countries, along with yours, where there's been a flurry of stories about the evils of encryption and how encryption simply defends criminals and particularly terrorists, and how encryption poses this enormous risk. Of course, the flip side of that is encryption enables the sorts of conversations and communications that support investigative journalism that ultimately can cause dramatic and favourable outcomes for societies. Defend encryption as a human right connected to freedom of expression and access to information. I mean, this is potentially a contentious principle or ideal, And that's because we're essentially saying journalists probably need to be activists in this space in terms of their reporting. So I want to hear debate about this. So I'm hoping you'll bring your views on this. And I think I alluded to this before, but the need to actually start training your whistleblowers in basic digital security. And that applies to both data at rest and data in transit, so the data that's stored and the data that's being transmitted. And look, having spent recently 2 years back in a major media institution after a long period as an academic and researcher, I can say while there were individuals this was Fairfax Media in Australia, who did excellent work and who were incredibly well aware of the risks and took great steps to protect their sources, many others working on stories that had the potential to cause those risks to elevate rapidly and dramatically had no idea about the concepts of data in transit or data at rest and what different methods might be involved in defending those. To be able to publish original documents where possible and safe to do so, with the reality winner caveat and various other caveats around the potential to identify sources inadvertently through the uploading of documents. So that's, again, potentially a risky recommendation, but well-intentioned. To recognise the importance of data sets as stories, and I think we'll get into this if we think about the WikiLeaks sort of manipulation argument, but the value of data as a resource for mining, for the production of other stories. And the publication of data sets in their entirety, caveat, where it's safe to do so. Then we get into the principles around the deletion of data that's been provided by sources when there's a request to do that. And of course that needs to be done in concert with a recognition of legal and ethical values and obligations, which are different, as you well know, internationally. And to consider deleting the data that you no longer need to reduce the risk of exposure of your source and also other action. Digital drop boxes, which are increasing in popularity for good reason in many cases within news organisations around the world, are actually able to deliver what they promise, which is a level of security that enables a whistleblower to feel safer than they might otherwise be. And I mean, arguably there's another principle for development here around explaining to your audience of potential confidential sources and whistleblowers how to use this technology and identifying what risks are associated with it. When you're whacking at the end of your story, please deliver your data en masse via this link. Verify the material that you're dealing with, and again this resonates with what you're saying, Joseph, in terms of the information and its public interest value, rather than the character or opinions or perspectives of the source or the whistleblower. But motivation is a fundamentally important characteristic to consider, and I'm sure many of you read the story about the Washington Post making a decision recently, which in a case which I think is highly relevant to this discussion, over an attempted manipulation of journalists with effectively a fake source. Yep. And the Washington Post took the very rare decision to publish a story about the attempted deception and unmasking the whistleblower / confidential source as a fraud. And I think that, triggers very interesting debates as well. To actively encourage your organisation to be an activist internally when it comes to ensuring that your colleagues and you have access to training and technology that you need to do your jobs. And I realise, particularly for journalists working in difficult environments in terms of the business model susceptibility to failure, training is often one of the first casualties, and it's never been more important in this arena, I think. To think about whistleblowers who have particularly high risks and thinking about how you might prepare them ahead of time for the fallout from those risks. Again, there's a sort of humane element to this. But journalists, many investigative journalists who have had long relationships with sources will have an investment in that person's well-being. I mean, that is the kind of humane approach to doing journalism. To understand the country and the regional and the international context that we work in when that comes to normative values, but also legal frameworks, and to sometimes advise even lawyers working with you. I mean, one of the things I've experienced is traditional lawyers working in traditional news organisations thinking about analogue laws that are fit for defending sources in legal action that is designed for an analogue world, and they're unfamiliar or not prepared to think about the sort of broader contexts. And in line, and this is a big one, it goes to the question of, is it even possible to promise protection to your sources or to a whistleblower now, when you have these convergent threats in the form of data interception, surveillance, and so on? How do you provide appropriate levels, or what is the appropriate level of information to provide a whistleblower or a confidential source that enables them to make a decision about whether in fact they will share information with you, and how will they do that? If what you're saying is, oh, I protect my sources, what does that actually mean in an area where source exposure is so easy? So those are some of the draft principles, or most of the draft principles we're considering. I think one of the big ones that's needs to be in there that isn't is how we deal with this question around distinguishing between hackers and whistleblowers, and what that means in terms of how a principle would evolve. But yes, I'll stop talking now, but we can come back to issues that we've forgotten, and feel free to catch me over the next few days. I'll be around.
Thank you, Julie. I have a few questions for you guys, and I've organized our actual discussion around a few keywords that you both touched here already, and the first one would be, of course, encryption. You both discussed extensively that encryption matters a lot in source protection, being them criminals, in your case, or whistleblowers in yours. And how does, for instance, encryption plays a part in your reporting? Where does it come in, and what enables you to do, and why it is so important?
So encryption comes in primarily and most obviously with communicating with the source. So if we're talking over a one-to-one chat program, those communications are going to be encrypted because law enforcement could quite easily try to get a copy of the server and then read the logs there. And I should just clarify that I don't only work with criminals. Yeah, I do have some whistleblowers. Like,
that was the sexy angle.
Yeah. Like, we did a piece recently which names the company that sells iPhone exploits to UK, Canadian, and Australian Five Eyes intelligence services. So that was a very different story to the criminal hackers. They weren't criminals. They were sources, I'll say, without getting more specific. So there's the communication there, but then also when you're handling a lot of data, whether that's going to be the Snowden documents or the Iraq war logs, or sometimes in my case a load of porn website accounts, encrypting at rest is incredibly important, because if that hard drive gets stolen and there's a load of credit card numbers on there, I've kind of failed my responsibility in actually keeping that data secure. And if it fell into the wrong hands and then someone used it or someone sold it, that could really, really backfire. So it's not just the communication with the source, it's also protecting the data itself, not from just like Chinese state hackers, but if someone pinches my rucksack and it has like a hard drive in it or something like that. It's vital and it's constant. Yeah.
And you mentioned ignorance when it comes to encryption and safety digital safety for journalists and sources. And do you see a positive trend in that? You mentioned that it is getting better and better.
There is a positive trend, but it's nowhere near the level of understanding or awareness. I mean, ignorance can be overcome through both self-education and an attempt to access training, for example, or even just widely reading. And what I've seen is a disconnect between practice, a sort of reluctance to accept that this is the threat level that we're talking about it being. And, you know, the constant framing of people like us as tinfoil hat wearing, I don't know if that resonates with the Italians as a saying, but the idea that we're so deeply paranoid we walk around with, you know, a tinfoil hat to protect us from interception, but that has changed. I mean, I think the Cambridge Analytica stuff has actually aided that, because it's, oh, they weren't so paranoid after all, you know. So I see positive trends, absolutely, but as I say, it's not happening as quickly, nor is it as widely understood as it should be. And I think, you know, that comes down to still, you know, questions in newsrooms all over around, well, I'm just working on, you know, I'm the fashion writer or I'm the sports reporter. I mean, why do I need to bother with encryption? And the answer is obviously because you're a sports reporter, you may be, you know, unaware, but the economic value of said code is great, and therefore the likelihood that eventually you will be reporting on a story that intersects with public policy or economics at such a level that there are vested interests, very powerful vested interests. Olympic Committee, for example.
Yeah, I mean, just as a completely hypothetical example, imagine you're a sports journalist that has a tip about an upcoming transfer or something like that. It is trivial for someone to send a phishing email, get into that account if there's no two-factor authentication, and then use that for, you know, insider trading or whatever it may be. But yeah, you're right. The threat does apply more generally to people who may not necessarily suspect it.
Indeed, and I think there needs to be a recognition that, you know, there are various tiers of protection required, but there needs to be a very basic level of encryption, I would argue, across the board, and that can come down to things like two-factor authentication.
It's probably still the perception that it is new, in the sense that this is something new that journalists didn't used to do 20 years ago, for instance. But if we look at what you said, for instance, from your practices, this is classic source protection strategies done with different tools, but the principles are the same.
Yeah, basically. Fundamentally, it's probably the same sort of thing. Instead of meeting in car parks, you're meeting on a server. I don't know where I'm going with that analogy, but basically, yeah, it's fundamentally the same thing, but just with technologically different tools,
But interestingly, one of the trends that we identified in that big UNESCO study was journalists increasingly saying, well, we're going back to basics. You know, we're going to revert to analog practices. You know, people literally reference dark car parks, you know, flags in pot plants, and techniques that were designed to minimise the risk. But then you have the reality that this is so ubiquitous that even driving on a dirt road is not going to necessarily save you from interception. So there's that. And then can I just add an anecdote, like talking about you, what if my rucksack is stolen? So many of you were probably aware that in Sweden, they take source protection so seriously, it's enshrined in law, that if as a journalist you enable the revelation of your source against their wishes or without their direct consent, you are going to be jailed. You know, so there are sanctions for source revelation that even the Swedes who interviewed the legislators and the bureaucrats, the legal officials acknowledged that they have this is so stringent to their philosophy of freedom of it's so central to their philosophy of freedom of expression, but the digital shifts have made those laws so much more difficult. You know, a journalist is exposed at a legal level in a way that, you know, we working in other contexts haven't had to think about. So.
And I think that this can lead us to the second keyword that I found. You may like the picture, may look familiar to you.
Should I tell them what that is?
Yeah.
Right, so that's from Motherboard, one of our videos. Well, actually, no, that's not from Motherboard. That's from Cyber War, which was a series on Viceland, which is Vice's TV channel. There is a hacker called Phineas Fisher who targeted an Italian surveillance company called Hacking Team, and then he dumped all of these emails, which were really interesting as someone who covers the surveillance industry, and WikiLeaks then made them searchable online. And I think it also just got pulled into the OCCRP database, so you can get them there as well. My colleague Lorenzo had Phineas Fisher as a source and would interview him regularly. The Cyber War video people wanted to interview Phineas on camera. Obviously, he said no, only if you do it by a puppet. So that's originally, I don't know if this is public, but originally he asked for Kermit the Frog, and we're like, mate, we can't do that. There's like loads of trademark and copyright things. Like, it's going to be an absolute like legal nightmare. So someone bought or made this puppet. And yeah, that's the visual representation of Phineas Fisher. Yeah.
And the reason why I put this image here is to ask you, what are the accountability measures that journalists have to take when they work with either hackers or whistleblowers in making the public aware of where the source material comes from? I mean, in your case, for instance, should a reporter, in your opinion, say this material came from what is probably a criminal that were stolen illegally and laws were broken and so on? So how do you think, how far can a journalist go in being accountable in mentioning the sourcing of his stories, for instance?
So ultimately, even if a piece of data came from a malicious nation-state, Russian hacker, wherever it may be, if that data or the documents or the emails or whatever is in the public interest, that just because it came from Russian hackers doesn't mean you should not report it. If there's still something there worth reporting, then by all means you should do so. But leaving out, I mean, I'll bring it up now. So everyone's probably familiar with the DNC hack and Guccifer 2. I call them Guccifer, not Guccifer or whatever. I stand by that even though I'm wrong. I'm going to die on that hill. So Guccifer 2 was a persona that was releasing information, releasing documents from the Democratic Party. But he claimed he was a Romanian hacker, but he was in fact being run by Russian military intelligence, and that's near certain. Even though the information was coming from him, there may have still been some stuff that was interesting in it, as in the infighting within the DNC and that sort of thing. But ignoring the quite obvious conclusion, and there was a lot of public evidence, even in summer 2017, 2016, whenever Guccifer first appeared, there was already pretty good evidence that he was actually run by Russian military intelligence. Ignoring that is probably doing a disservice to the reader when that is a really substantial part of the story. And maybe you would do a separate story by itself, or if you're doing a thing on these documents, it only takes 1 or 2 lines or a paragraph just to include the fact that this came from Russia, and maybe the reader can then include that context when they're reading the piece themselves. It's not much of a sacrifice to include that information.
Yeah, and this applies to whistleblowers
Absolutely.
As well.
Yes.
And for instance, I know that some media companies that use encryption software such as SecurDrop, for instance, they don't mention in the stories that the material came from the SecurDrop or other whistleblower platform because they don't want to compromise the source. So what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, look, I think it can be complex, right? So, but you need to assess as a journalist, as an editor, as a publisher, that you have this obligation to protect your sources. Yes, you must be scrupulous about ensuring that your methods are appropriately secure, but at the same time, I think there are really interesting intersections with the debates about trust in journalism, for example. And this often gets caught up with the sort of fake news debates, you know, where many members of the broader public are unaware of the reasoning behind source confidentiality. You know, they see it as lazy journalism, for example. And I think, you know, in terms of accountability as professionals, but also ensuring that we're holding our sources to account. You know, we're doing the appropriate due diligence on verifying their information, but also assessing their motivation, which does not necessarily rule out, as you say, the value, the public interest value of what they share, but it may actually provide you with an opportunity to provide context that enables understanding within the audiences about the motivation, which is important information to share. You know, you are rarely going to be in a situation where you have a confidential source or a whistleblower who is, you know, pure as the driven snow, and you know, the Pollyanna of the story. You know, there's complexities that I think you need to unpack.
And we already touched this before, but state actors can be sources, as you were saying, and they can be hackers, they can be whistleblowers, and we live in times where cyber war and information war are very hyped. US versus Russia and so on is kind of the framework of basically anything geopolitical today. Do you think that journalists can be the victim of the system when they are used by state actors to conduce information or propaganda operation? So what's the risk there to be involved in this very dirty system, for instance?
I mean, a journalist is just at risk as much as if they took information from Guccifer 2 as they are if they take a controlled leak from MI5, which then goes in the Times of London. It's essentially the same thing. It's still a deliberate, controlled exposure of information by a state, even if that's a Western democracy, or if it's a more malicious actor who's clearly doing it for malicious purposes. Ultimately, it's still the same sort of manipulation going on there. So, again, to the earlier point, if you have a piece and you're going to say, hey, this information came from a likely Russian hacker, maybe more people should say, hey, this information came from a MI5 security source. Yeah. But obviously, I mean, I'm not harping on about the very good work of journalists at higher mainstream outlets who obviously have access to these agencies, but they have to make the same consideration. Yeah. And if they did name, well, not name, but let's say they did put it was MI5 or MI6 or whatever, well, that source isn't going to talk to them again. And maybe that was a reason that some people, when they received documents from Guccifer 2, maybe they didn't want to include that because they wanted to keep conversing with this hacker.
Yeah, this also this has to do also with anonymous sources, which are, you know, most of the time, like Italy has a tradition of anonymous sources which happen to be very powerful people into politics or into the intelligence community who speak to journalists as they were their spokesperson. So, do you think there is a trend where hackers and whistleblowers can be used more by intelligence community to conduct information operations? I'm thinking to this because you mentioned frauds in your talk.
Yeah, so I think, so I'll say this, what we're seeing, one of the other projects I've been working on is actually a curriculum for journalists and journalism students at university, for example, examining the impact of the fake news era on reportage. It's done, it's not out yet. But one of the themes that emerged was the attempted manipulation of journalists to erode trust in a journalist because of deception that succeeded. And one of the ways in which that's happening is through the leaking, you know, it's what we used to call astroturfing. So the leaking of information that is maybe partially true. AstroTurf, for those of you who are unaware, is an American product, literally fake grass. So if you don't want to mow the lawn, you rip up the grass and you put down this faux product on top, and that's where the term comes from. So it's the idea of a veneer of reality or a veneer of truth mixed with disinformation, and we're seeing that as an increasing risk to journalists and journalism because it attacks credibility. So you know, the journalist is exposed as somebody who reported in a sloppy way and was tricked. You know, it's trolling kind of at a massive level, and state actors clearly involved in that. There are examples internationally.
I mean, a recent example of that was, I don't know if you're familiar with Maddo from the States, I think MSNBC, and after The Intercept published a piece about Russian hacking and interference, somebody was shopping around these dodgy-looking documents. So then Rachel Maddow, this cable news host, got the document and says, look, this is a big thing. Someone is out there trying to sow discord, like it could be a state, and it's just some dude. And like, there wasn't this grand conspiracy. So one basically is like, it kind of can go in the other direction as well. When you have these conspiracies, you can just have a dude who's just like doing some MS Paint. And then that's even, exactly. And that's also really quite embarrassing for the journalist, who's ironically trying to show that journalists are being scammed.
So it gets more and more complex.
And to make it even more complex, the last keyword I chose is weaponization, which we have been, it's a term that has been discussed a lot in the wake of the DNC WikiLeaks case that I know you, Joseph, are going to discuss more in details in another panel, but what I would like to discuss more in details here, and you also mentioned this in your presentation, is data sets that are the story. So what happened with WikiLeaks, for instance, was the publication of the dumping of digital data in tens of thousands at a time without any kind of verification of what was there inside. And Zeynep Tufekci, who is a scholar who wrote extensively about this, said that this is a way of censorship information, because if you publish 10,000 emails at a time, there is no way to actually look for stories. So this is probably, again, interconnected with the state actors with the state actors operation that we discussed previously. I'm not saying that the WikiLeaks was 100% a state actor operation. I don't have details to say that, but it is interconnected somehow.
Yeah.
What's the risk in this?
I mean, because we already spoke about the DNC thing, I guess I'll just mention that in the style that WikiLeaks increasingly releases information, which is unredacted and without context or misleading context, increases the effectiveness of the weaponization. So if you release a load of emails and then people dig through that and they find the Pizzagate conspiracy, which is where this originated from, because there's no redactions and it's also releasing stuff that's completely not in the public interest, like John Podesta's risotto recipe, people are going to try and find patterns in there, and that's going to contribute to the confusion that this bad journalism, which you could categorize it as, it's going to increase the effectiveness of that chaos, I think.
So I'm going to respond with a question, and this is kind of my view really, but are we at the point now where we're recognising the important role of editing and curation within journalism? Are we moving back from an era where openness was everything and masses of information unfiltered was the norm and the appropriate standard? And
yeah. So I mean, this came up in one of the first panels today with Jeff Jarvis and co. And this move away from, hey, everybody's right, let's just put your opinion out, to, no, the New York Times is better than XYZ. We have that with news articles and blog posts, whatever it may be, and we're probably, I think we do also have it with the handling of data dumps as well. Like releasing a curated, redacted if necessary data dump is qualitatively better piece of journalism than just throwing it out there and saying, deal with it.
So I was sad that we only have a few minutes before having to close up. So if anyone from the audience has a question, this is the right moment. And I know there is a microphone around, so just raise your hand. Yeah. C'è un microfono per una domanda? Ah, it's coming. It's just right there.
Yes, thanks. That was a really good talk. I think it would be really useful if more of the industry heard that. But this is more towards Joseph. I just wondered, could you talk about how your relationship with hackers has developed? I'm sure you have lots of sources now and you're used to interacting with them regularly. But what was it like at the beginning and how's it sort of changed?
So it started reporting on the dark web marketplaces, such as Silk Road, where they sell heroin, cocaine, whatever it may be. And then after that, when the dark web started facilitating more the sale of stolen data, hackers more naturally were gravitating towards those markets. So then stories were coming out of that. As for your question about how they develop, you do have hackers who will breach one website, they'll give you the data, and then you'll cover it. They'll just come back to you, because I presume it's simpler for them and they don't have to do a load of research on who is covering hackers and who isn't. Quite a lot of them are complete one-offs and you'll never see them again. Others come up and they'll contact you under a different name, but like you definitely know it's still them. And then, yeah, some are very established who do come up again and again.
I think we have time for one more question. Yep, here in the front.
Hi, I kind of wanted to go back to the accountability question, and I guess it kind of relates to both the hack and leak tactic that's being used by state actors. So hack data and then use a proxy, or use your own website like DC Leaks in the case of Russia, or WikiLeaks if you want. If it's a longer term play though, rather than the individual leak or the individual hack, and your objective is long term in terms of an information warfare scenario, is it not a great risk that journalists just become useful idiots for being proxies for the release of information? And yes, we do an amazing reporting on a leak, but the leak is actually in the background come about as a result of a hack that was possibly done by a state actor, maybe at 2 or 3 steps removed, and maybe as a journalist you're just not aware. So is there even any way to combat that scenario?
I mean, hopefully you could go through the documents and then find some clues, such as like in the Guccifer hack, there's metadata where the files were in Russian language and the timestamps of when the file had been edited was different to when it had been created and that sort of thing. But yeah, ultimately, in some situations, you may not know where the data really came from. And I think there are some other WikiLeaks cases where people suspected that there was actually an Iranian hack, which then led to it, but there hasn't been much attention on that because that's been really, really difficult to prove. In the DNC Guccifer case, we got pretty lucky because they were really crap at covering up their tracks. I mean, they leaked IP addresses and metadata everywhere. But I'm sure there are examples where we don't know where it came from. Yeah, so there is the real danger of that, I would say.
It's kind of higher level verification, you know, forensic analysis of data and a very specialised skill, and you may never get to the base of it. But I think you've hit on an important point there, which is about responsibility for investigative journalism that doesn't stop with the source and the impacts. It goes to the provenance of the data. And yes, much more needs to be done probably in many of these instances, because not everybody is working with the skill level of, or the knowledge base of Joseph. So
I think we have to close it here. Thank you very much, Julie and Joseph, for this talk. It was brilliant. Thank you guys for coming up, and enjoy the festival. Thank you.
And please take a leaflet. I do not want to cart them back to Sydney.
Yeah, thank you. Good job. Thanks a lot. Yeah.